Alrighty, hello everyone. A very warm welcome to you all. My name is Kiona Blanks, and I will be your moderator for this event. I'm a representative for the World's Youth for Climate Justice movement. I'm also a sophomore at Stanford University and an intern at the Institute for Climate and Peace. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to this side event at the opening of the 75th session of the UN General Assembly. We have gathered here today to launch the World's Youth for Climate Justice, which aims to secure our collective futures by taking climate change and human rights to the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice. You will hear the acronym ICJ used a lot in this event. Just know that that's an acronym for the International Court of Justice. So without further ado, after months of hard work, we are excited to launch our movement, which has been the results of many passionate youths from across the globe coming together to address the climate crisis. As part of tonight's event, we will be launching our website and premiering our short animation that explains just how we will seek justice at the ICJ. We also have an exciting lineup of panelists who will be speaking on a range of topics, and it's our hope that these panelists will inspire you all to heed our call to action and become part of the solution to the crisis we all face. To kick things off, we'll be sharing our animation with you. It's called The Power of the People. The animation was heavily inspired by the stark reality of the adverse effects of climate change on the basic human rights of children and young people from the Pacific Islands and other climate vulnerable countries.
In every year of the last decade, our world has seen greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise and shatter records. But those responsible for burning the most fossil fuels have not experienced the most direct consequences of climate change. It has been us. The hundreds of millions of people living on the front line of the climate crisis. If global temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius in my lifetime, countries like mine will vanish beneath the waves. I will be forced to leave the land where my ancestors are buried, and to tell my children they have nowhere to call home. At Rio de Janeiro, Kyoto, and later at Paris, we were promised action. But despite ever more opportunities to address this crisis, the planet is hurtling towards climate catastrophe. Existing international agreements have not provided countries with legal clarity on their responsibilities to reduce emissions, leading to inaction. To break the impasse, the UN General Assembly must request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change and human rights. All it would take is a simple majority vote from UN member states. An advisory opinion is not legally binding but carries great legal and moral authority, encouraging all nations to protect the human rights of people affected by climate change. An opinion from the highest court in the world would also help to build a critical global coalition uniting governments and international institutions, and would define exactly what existing bodies of laws nations should follow. In the past, advisory opinions have been instrumental in establishing international laws on the right to self-determination, the prevention of genocide, and nuclear disarmament. We believe it could do the same for climate change. A planet in crisis doesn't have to be our future. If there is power in the world to save humanity from environmental disaster, it is the power of the people. But time is running out, and we have to act now. Please visit our website to join us.
Wow, there's truly power in the people. It's wonderful to see that there's still optimism and hope despite the circumstances we find ourselves in. And there's reason for that optimism, because of the existing networks of solidarity that exist across the globe. As we know, climate solidarity is needed more than ever right now, especially in frontline countries. And as the video highlighted, a planet in crisis does not have to be our future, and it is our hope to change this trajectory through this campaign. Moving ahead, now we'll have a word from the spokesperson for the World's Youth for Climate Justice movement, Miguel van der Velden. Miguel will be speaking on how the climate justice movement began and the decision to unite under one banner to campaign for the ICJ. Miguel is a representative of two coalitions. One, the World's Youth for Climate Justice from the Caribbean, and two, the Caribbean Youth Environment Network. Miguel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kiona. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone here. Bon dia, bon tarde, and bon noche, as we say in Papiamento. My name is Miguel van der Velden. I speak to you now on behalf of the Caribbean, and specifically the youth of the Caribbean, and especially the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, or CYEN, and the University of the West Indies students and alumni, who are really spearheading climate action in the Caribbean. I'm from the big ocean state of Aruba, an island in the Southern Caribbean Sea. I'm also a journalist, so I like to be very honest about what I communicate. And today, I'm here to communicate to you all the importance of the WYCJ movement. More ambitiously, I'm here to convince you to join our movement. So what is the WYCJ? WYCJ stands for the World's Youth for Climate Justice. The World's Youth for Climate Justice is an umbrella organization that is purposely formed to unite youth all over the world who are seeking climate justice. You may not have noticed us until very recently, but youth from across the oceans and the continents have been on a journey to climate justice for years now. And the good thing is we're gaining momentum. Some names you might have heard already, like Greta Thunberg, for example. Others you might not, but we are all united by one fact, which is that our entire lives have been, and from now on, will be shaped every day by what happens to the climate. So you can think of the WYCJ as a train. So far, youth have been walking to climate justice, but we are tired of walking. And we've realized that walking is too slow. Luckily, we live in the 21st century, so we have all kinds of faster modes of transportation to get places. Now, flying is obviously not the preferred choice climate-wise, so we think of WYCJ as the train, the high-speed train, hopefully, that is taking us straight to climate justice at the world's highest court, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. Along the way, picking up all the youth who have been affected by climate change and will continue to be affected by climate change for years to come. We are seeing now that the climate crisis has become a global problem that can only be addressed through an international coalition that bridges the gap between government and civil society. In this looming climate catastrophe, we choose to retain hope, we choose to live with dignity, and we choose to live without fear of climate change denying us and our children the freedom that all generations have had before us. That is, the freedom of a stable and a healthy environment. To secure a common future and grasping the inhumane reality that is the climate crisis, we, the world's youth for climate justice, are working towards a concrete and well-justified solution that will catalyze rapid transformative change to embrace true climate solutions. I come from a long line of traditional lawyers. My great-great-great-grandfather, Yajaira, was one of the Wayu palabreros, a palabrero being literally a traditional lawyer, who negotiated the peace between the Wayu people, indigenous people, and the country of Venezuela. My grandfather then was the first ancestor to study Western law, followed by my mother. But I say this to illustrate that the idea of justice is more than something we just came up with now or recently that didn't exist in our history. We, the youth of the world, aren't embarking on a new journey. The rails for our train, the WYCJ train that will carry us to the International Court of Justice, were laid long ago. What's new about this movement and about the climate crisis is that it is so generational. This is highly visible in the Caribbean today. In December of last year, UNICEF published a report called Children Uprooted in the Caribbean on how stronger hurricanes linked to a changing climate are driving child displacement. The report illustrates that in the past 5 years, the number of people internally displaced by storms and flooding increased sixfold in the Caribbean small island states. Nearly 3.5 million people, of which over 750,000 children, were displaced. Again, 6 times more than the preceding 5-year period. And it's no coincidence that the years from 2014 to 2018 with the warmest 5-year period on record. But the thing is, numbers don't do the climate crisis any justice. Instead, think of the individual lives that have been entirely uprooted due to climate change. Alil Harris, 5 years old, has been living with his mother in a tent for 3 years on the island of Barbuda since Hurricane Irma destroyed their home in September 2017, exactly 3 years ago. Jamare and Kathleen Moreau, 11 and 4 years old, respectively, had to be evacuated from their home in the Bahamas in September 2019, 1 year ago, after Hurricane Dorian blasted through, and they probably still haven't returned. These are the individual lives that are being destroyed. We can't take the idea of home for granted. These children don't have homes anymore. And it's not just young children that are vulnerable, but all youth. In the Caribbean, youth unemployment ranges from 18 to 47%. That's nearly half of all youth that are unemployed in some areas. How do these youth adapt when they're forced to flee their homes for weeks, months, years, or even permanently, and don't even have an income? The top 6 countries and territories with the highest annual average of internal displacement in the world are all Caribbean island states. What would these figures look like in another, not even 50 years, but just another 5 or 10? Keeping in mind that what we've seen in the last 5 years was unimaginable right up until it happened. I don't want to wait until the next unimaginable thing happens. I've learned that what we are facing in the world today is the nastiest pandemic that we've had, a pandemic of greed and selfishness in some countries that has led to the loss of livelihoods that we've seen in other countries. Islands in the Pacific are sinking, coastal states are flooding, there's the loss of freshwater supplies all over the world, and so much more. So, like our Pacific brothers and sisters, our only wish in the Caribbean is peace and well-being. Our only wish is the opportunity for our people to live in dignity, both now and in the future. And it is also the vision of the WYCJ movement in a nutshell. My request then is simple. Given the gravity and inherent inequality, generationally and geographically, of the climate crisis, climate change must now be treated as a matter of international law. So I ask you all, please join us in achieving this. If I was really cheesy, I would say now, all aboard, but I'll spare you that. I'll just say thank you all very much for listening. Masha danki.
Wow, Miguel, that was a wonderful breakdown of the WYCJ. And your high-speed train analogy was just beautiful. And thank you so much for highlighting the intergenerational nature of the campaign as well. We are very honored to be working with you. Thank you so much for that, Miguel. All right, well, we will now be moving on to our panel discussion, which will discuss a range of issues within climate justice. And after the panel discussion, we will have a Q&A session where you all will be able to ask your questions to our panelists. Kicking things off, our first panelist is Alexandria Villasenor. She will speak on her personal story in climate activism and on the gravity of the climate crisis with a few examples, such as the California wildfires going on right now. Alexandria is an American climate activist who is also the co-founder of 2 organizations, the US Youth Climate Strike and Earth Uprising. She is also a strong supporter of the Fridays for Future campaign. Please welcome this passionate young climate activist, Alexandria Villasenor. Alexandria, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody speak today. I first off want to start off with talking about why I got involved in climate activism. So the reason that I got involved in climate activism was because I saw the effects of the climate crisis in my community. And so I am originally from Northern California. I was born and raised there, but I ended up moving to New York City in August of 2018 when my mom came to do her master's degree here. And so of course I went back and forth quite a bit. And so on one visit back home, I was there when the Camp Fire broke out in Paradise, California. And so that fire quickly became California's worst wildfire in its history. Of course, in the past couple of weeks, you have seen that topped because of climate-fueled wildfires. But after being there during the Camp Fire, My hometown got a lot of the smoke. At one point, it was the worst air quality in the world at the time. And so I have asthma and it was making me extremely sick. And so my family ended up sending me back to New York City early from that trip. And I was very upset, of course, because California is on fire all year round now. We don't have a wildfire season, it's just the whole entire year. And so after researching and seeing the connection between climate change and California's wildfires, I knew that I had to do something and I had to take some sort of action. And so that's what spurred me into getting involved in climate activism in the first place. And I took all of the climate anxiety and ego grief I was feeling it, and I turned it into action by going and striking on December 14th of 2018 in front of the United Nations headquarters. And I actually ended up striking every Friday all the way up until the pandemic. So that was over a year of actions every Friday. But recently, within this past month, we have seen California actually hit these record-breaking wildfires. Throughout the entire West Coast, 4 million acres burned because of the wildfires. And so it's extremely upsetting to see what's happening because those are climate-fueled wildfires that we're seeing. And what we're also seeing is that a lot of people don't understand how to keep themselves safe, and we don't have enough public knowledge about keeping ourselves safe from these climate change disasters. So a lot of people, for example, were going outside not wearing the right masks that keep out the smoke particles from them inhaling. And in the future, that can cause lung cancer and so many other health issues. And a lot of people don't even know how to seal up their houses from the wildfires, because you'd be surprised with how many places smoke can come into a home from a fire. And so we're seeing the effects of the climate crisis right now, but we don't have these conversations about adaptation enough. We need to start having them more because we need to see how to protect ourselves. We're focusing on mitigation, but we need to start having conversations around adaptation. And so actually, today is September 25th, and it was another International Fridays for Future climate strike where young people were really calling for action. And here in New York City, there is a march against environmental racism where there were teach-ins throughout the entire city led by XR Youth NYC. And so we're seeing this movement, we're starting to grow and adapt because of all of the issues we're starting to see in our country and all around the world because of climate change. And so don't worry, these protests, we were being extra careful, and we've actually been changing the way we are doing actions due to COVID and other geopolitical issues. So we're finding ways of still taking action while still staying safe and adapting to this current climate that we're seeing. And so young people, besides taking direct action and other forms of action, are also looking at different ways to hold our politicians accountable. So one thing we are seeing a lot of right now is more legal actions that young people are taking. Like you have seen in Mexico and Canada, there were young people who are holding their countries accountable. And 6 Portuguese youth are taking their country to the International Court of Justice. And so more young people are doing these actions. And actually, this past week was New York City Climate Week, so the United Nations Climate Summit, and it's the 1-year anniversary of the petition that I'm a part of, the Children vs. Climate Crisis. And a little bit of background on the Children vs. Climate Crisis petition. Myself, Greta Thunberg, and 14 other children from all around the world ended up filing this last year, saying that 5 countries were violating our rights by their inaction on the climate crisis. And that's Argentina, Brazil, Germany, Turkey, and France. And that was filed to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. And we're saying that these 5 countries are violating our rights by their inaction on the climate crisis. And so right now we are waiting for these countries to respond because it has been granted admissible. So now we're waiting for the countries to respond to see what they're actually going to do. Some people say about this petition, well, why isn't the United States a part of it? Or why aren't other countries a part of it? Well, the United States, first of all, did not ratify the rights of the child. And the reason why these 5 countries, we are able to hold them accountable is because they ended up ratifying Article 6 on the convention, saying that if they do not uphold these standards in protecting children's rights, then we can hold them accountable. And that is exactly what we're doing. And so if you want to learn more about that, there's a new documentary on it that follows myself and 4 other petitioners from the Marshall Islands, Alaska, Africa, the places that are really being affected by the climate crisis. And that documentary is Earth Focus on KCET. And I really recommend watching it because you can see how young people's rights are really being violated by this. And so I really want to end this off, though, with a call to action. We're having all these actions with direct actions, legal actions. And so there's so many ways for people to get involved that sometimes they don't know how to during this time. And so there's so many things you can do during a pandemic. And the first thing that I recommend to people to do to get involved is first, find your climate story. How are you being impacted by the climate crisis? Because we're seeing the effects of climate change all around the world, but people are being impacted in different ways. So look to your community and how are you being impacted by that? And from there, you're able to see what you really want to do. Some people see what's happening to their community and they feel just so angry that they want to do something. So find an organization of direct action or others that have the same mission. If you want to get involved in solutions, actually stop and mitigate what's happening in your community. Then find an organization that has those same values. There's so much you can do, and I really recommend taking those steps. The last thing I recommend is if you want to get inspired and read about from all sorts of women in climate, there is a new book out called All We Can Save that features 60 women in climate. And they talk about there's from poetry to others who work in the political area. I really recommend that you read this book if you want to get inspired by what you can do to take action.
Wow, thank you, Alexandria, for those very thoughtful and inspiring remarks on your personal journey in climate activism. Your thoughts on how to safely take action during a pandemic, and also the various ways young people can hold politicians accountable are very actionable right now. I know we all want to take action right now, so thank you so much for highlighting these steps we can take. We're very proud to be working with you, and we completely support all the incredible work that you do. So thank you for being here. Great. Our next speaker is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Dr. David Boyd. Dr. Boyd will be speaking on the linkage between the environment and human rights, which has become vital to addressing the climate crisis. Dr. Boyd is also a prolific author, a member of the World Commission on Environmental Law, an expert advisor for the UN's Harmony with Nature initiative, and last but not least, a member of the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide. Sir, welcome to the panel. The floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Great, thanks very much, Kiona. And I just want to say those were fantastic speeches by Alexandria and Miguel. Thanks for those words of wisdom, and you're so articulate, so passionate. It's actually difficult to follow in your footsteps. My journey as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights really began in 2018. My first country mission was to Fiji in the South Pacific, and it was literally a life-changing experience. As a Canadian, I had never been to a country that was really suffering such dramatic impacts of climate change so directly. I visited Vunidogoloa, which is one of the first communities in the world that had to be entirely relocated from an idyllic waterfront village to several kilometers inland. And you know, the impacts on their human rights, their rights to culture, their rights to health, having to walk down a trail in the punishing heat every day to the ocean to get the fish that they survive upon, was really devastating for me to see. And then I also visited to what they call in Fiji informal settlements. And these are places where people have moved, and Fiji was the victim of Tropical Cyclone Winston in 2016, which is the strongest storm to ever reach land in the Southern Hemisphere, with devastating consequences for the country of Fiji. And of course, consistent with the science of climate change, the tropical storms are becoming stronger and more frequent. And so thousands of people in Fiji were rendered homeless by Tropical Cyclone Winston. They've moved to these informal settlements. The government of Fiji, to its credit, has been able to deliver electricity and safe drinking water to these people, but they don't have access to safe sanitation facilities. And so they have pit toilets. One of the communities I visited was right beside a river. The other was right beside the ocean. And they get periodic flooding, which washes the waste out of the pit toilets and contaminates their food and water supplies. And as a result, these communities are facing outbreaks of waterborne diseases like cholera, which are a direct consequence of climate change. And so, you know, just to see this is really, it's so important for us to recognize. And these were the stories that Miguel was saying and that Alexandria was saying, that climate change in many places of the world is still perceived as something that happens somewhere else, sometime in the future. It's not. Climate change is here, it's now, it's a major human rights issue. And this is where things get a bit more positive, I think, because human rights and what the scientists are saying, what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and what youth are saying is that we need rapid, systemic, and transformative changes to deal with this global crisis, this global emergency. And if we look back at the history of humanity in the last several centuries, we see that human rights actually is a catalyst for those kinds of transformative changes. The abolition of slavery, the women's rights movement, the indigenous peoples movement, the movement to end apartheid in South Africa, and more recently, the LGBTQ+ movement. All of these powerful social movements have harnessed human rights to transform society. And so in the face of the climate emergency, it's really exciting to learn that a new human right has emerged just in recent decades called the human right to a healthy environment. And this right, which includes clean water, clean air, a safe climate, healthy biodiversity and ecosystems, healthy and sustainably produced food, and non-toxic environments in which people can live, work, study, and play, is already recognized by more than 80% of the United Nations member countries. That's 156 out of 193 countries. And the big challenge now is to move, there's two challenges actually. One is to make sure that the right to a healthy environment is universal in scope, so that everyone, everywhere, no matter where they live, has the right to a healthy environment. And second, we have to take those beautiful words off the paper and turn them into action. And there's amazing things being done on that front in many countries around the world too. You have countries like Costa Rica that's now got more than a quarter of its land in national parks and has 98% of its electricity comes from clean renewable sources. Norway's got 99% of its electricity from clean renewable sources, and over 70% of new vehicles sold in Norway are emissions-free electric vehicles. And more importantly, from a youth perspective, youth are taking hold of this right to a healthy environment and using it to force governments to make changes. In Colombia, I think the most important climate change lawsuit that's been brought to date was brought by 25 children and youth against the government of Colombia, arguing that their constitutional right to a healthy environment is being violated by deforestation in the Amazon region of Colombia. And that case went to the Supreme Court of Colombia, and the Supreme Court of Colombia agreed with the young people and found that their right to a healthy environment was being violated because deforestation in the Amazon contributes to climate change, which violates their right to a healthy environment. And the government was ordered to sit down with leading scientists, the young people, and government agencies and come up with a plan to end deforestation in the Amazon within a matter of months. So that's really exciting. That's a concrete example of how this right can change things. The case that Alexandria is involved in is a case I'm also involved in, the case which 16 young people have brought against 5 countries at the Committee on the Rights of the Child. I'm in conjunction with my predecessor as the Special Rapporteur, Professor John Knox, we're filing an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, arguing that yes, indeed, these 5 countries have violated their human rights obligations towards these young people. There's also a very interesting case that we're involved in at the Human Rights Committee, which is where the Torres Strait Islanders have filed a case against Australia for violating their human rights. And the Torres Strait Islanders, of course, are already suffering from the same kinds of things many people in small island states and coastal nations are suffering from: rising sea levels, stormwater surges, saltwater contamination of their food and water. And so these are just the tip of the iceberg of cases. I'm also involved in a case in Norway where Greenpeace and a youth organization filed a lawsuit against the government of Norway saying that opening up new areas of the Arctic to offshore oil and gas exploration violates their right to a healthy environment. That case will be heard by the Supreme Court of Norway in November. And finally, the most recent case I've become involved in is in Brazil, where a bunch of people have sued the government, arguing that their constitutional right to a healthy environment is violated. First of all, they said it was violated by the government's failure to properly use the climate fund, which was set up by the previous government to do adaptation and mitigation. But the judge of the Brazilian Supreme Court has actually broadened the case and is now saying that he will look at the government's whole suite of climate policies and judge whether they are consistent with the constitutional right to a healthy environment in Brazil. And so these cases are popping up all over the world, and they're popping up because human rights are so powerful in enabling people to hold governments accountable. For too long, governments have gotten away with promising, and then not taking the actions that are needed. The last court case I want to mention, just because it's relevant to what the World Youth for Climate Justice are doing, is an advisory opinion from the Inter-American Court of on Human Rights, which came out 3 years ago on human rights and the environment. And the Inter-American Court issued a very powerful advisory opinion clarifying that the right to a healthy environment is fundamental for the existence of humankind, and that governments have a wide range of obligations as a result of that right to a healthy environment. And that advisory opinion from the Inter-American Court has been used by Supreme Courts and constitutional courts throughout Latin America and is being cited all around the world. So that's the power of an advisory opinion, which to some people may sound kind of like something airy. That's, how does it actually translate? It translates through court decisions in national courts that force governments to take action. And I just want to end on an optimistic note. You know, we have the solutions to deal with climate change, both on the mitigation side and the adaptation side. The costs of solar electricity and wind electricity have crashed over the last 20 years. And even the world's leading energy experts had no idea this would happen so quickly. The International Energy Agency, for example, is the world's leading forecaster of how our energy system will evolve in the future. Back in the year 2000, the world's total of global electricity generated from solar panels was 1 gigawatt, which is 1 billion watts. That's a lot, it's a big number, but it's small in terms of global energy consumption. The International Energy Agency said that if the right policies were put in place and investments were made, we could get 7 times as much solar by the year 2020. Well, here we are in the year 2020, and did we make it? Did we get to 7 gigawatts of solar? No. We're over 600 gigawatts of solar. We add 7 gigawatts every month to the system. And so what the world's leading experts thought would take 20 years, we're doing in 30 days. And what we should be doing is just pouring money into this. As part of the post-COVID, post-pandemic economic recovery plan, we should be pouring money into solar, creating millions of jobs around the world, putting up billions of solar panels, and solving the climate crisis with just simple, clean, renewable electricity. So by all means, young people, you are the engine that is driving this train that Miguel talked about. And thank you to you for your efforts on this. I'm absolutely delighted and honored to support the initiative of the world's youth for climate justice. Yes, absolutely. We should work and do everything needed to get an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Boyd. Thank you so much for your insights on the linkage between the environment and human rights, which sometimes feels all too neglected in this field. And thank you for sharing about the human right to a healthy environment and the actions surrounding this human right. It's so exciting to hear how a beautiful abstract international sentiment like that can be such a powerful tool for action. Yeah, thank you so much for your support. We are so honored to have you here.
My pleasure.
I would now like to introduce our next speaker, the Honorable Ralph Regenvanu, who is the leader of the opposition of the Vanuatu government. As a veteran politician, the Honorable Regenvanu is renowned for bringing numerous positive changes in Vanuatu, such as the preservation of culture, indigenous rights, and traditional knowledge. It is undeniable that he is a Pacific climate champion whose leadership and efforts have not gone unnoticed. Today, the Honorable Regenvanu will be sharing why the issue of climate change and human rights are important for ocean sustainable states like Vanuatu. In addition, he will be speaking on why the Pacific states are seeking guidance and climate justice from the ICJ. The Honorable Regenvanu, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Port Vila in the Republic of Vanuatu in the Southwest Pacific Ocean. And it's really a great privilege and honor for me to be involved in this webinar. And I really want to congratulate everyone that's involved. And I'm really inspired by what's been said so far, and especially this new network of young people that's being set up to push governments. So I'm obviously a member of parliament. I'm a legislator. I've been elected to represent the people. I was born when Vanuatu was still a colony called the New Hebrides. So I experienced, when I was very young, the transition to becoming an independent republic. And we've just celebrated our 40 years of independence. But basically we have what happened is we became self-determined, which we've got to remember was also something that came out of the ICJ, this right, fundamental right to self-determination that all people have. And in the current world order, becoming an independent state representing the people is probably the highest manifestation of self-determination. And as a legislator or a member of parliament, my duty is to ensure that the people of Vanuatu have the best possible access to life's opportunities and have their fundamental human rights respected as are enshrined in our Bill of Rights, in our Constitution. And so these are things we've heard like, the right to healthy environment, the right to education, the right to health, the right to access, the right to water. And all of these things are things that we have to, as members of government, we have to push to make sure our people receive. And so this is becoming more and more difficult in the context of climate change, because what happens with climate change is that the resources that we are trying to amass as a state that has the right to levy taxes on its population so that they contribute to the delivery of public services. We are finding that now we're in a situation where, for example, a few years ago, we had our first ever tropical cyclone category 5 to hit Vanuatu, and it wiped out 64% of our GDP. And then just this year again, we had our second category 5 tropical cyclone, again, equivalent amount of GDP. So it doesn't matter how wealthy you are, it takes on, you start to incur costs that are beyond your capacity to manage. And so we see this in other parts of the world as well. We see other countries being hit by tropical cyclones, particularly in the Caribbean, equivalent to, 200% of their GDP. So Vanuatu is a small island developing state. We're a least developed country. Where are we going to get the resources we need to make sure the basic human rights of our people are satisfied? And also their right to development, their right to water, their right to health, their right to education can be achieved. We're in a situation where we were not responsible for what's happening in terms of climate change. There is an element of someone's got to pay for this. And why are we having to pay for it when we didn't cause this? So this is the concept of loss and damage. And this iniquity is a main force behind climate change for a country like Vanuatu. And as long as those who profit from the production of greenhouse gases and not those who suffer its most extreme consequences like us, climate change will continue to be something that will accelerate. And so Vanuatu is one of the countries within IOSIS, the Organization of Small Island States, who push this loss and damage idea and this polluter pays principle. And we have of course, the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, which was enshrined in the Paris Climate Agreement. But the problem is so much, we're how many years on from Paris, or how many years on from Warsaw, and the resources available that the world committed to providing for countries like us are just not there. They're not being committed. So we need to establish some sort of liability to ensure that we can get these resources available for our own development. And so I was inspired by the Pacific Island chapter of this youth movement when I was foreign minister of Vanuatu last year and the year before. We managed to get this onto the agenda of the Pacific Islands Forum. And so the leaders of the Pacific agreed that we would look into obtaining an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice so that we've heard about the advisory opinion, the power of an advisory opinion, that there is causation, that there is liability for climate change, and there are victims and there are perpetrators, and there needs to be some sort of justice in how we deal with these issues. While the Paris Agreement enshrines this principle of climate justice, The fact that the resources are not being allocated as the countries promised means that this grave injustice grows by the hour, and we need to rectify it or balance the scales. And this is why we think this this international advisory opinion, ICJ advisory opinion, will be important. And we are currently, Vanuatu is currently in the process of getting the opinions it needs and getting the funding it needs for an international campaign. It's going to be very costly, but we're happy that we found some good funding. And I think the role of youth is to push their governments to sign up to this, because we're going to need, as we saw in the animation earlier, we're going to need a majority of countries in the General Assembly to support this. 2/3 would be great. If we can get 2/3 of countries in the General Assembly to vote in favor of seeking an advisory opinion for the ICJ on the issue of climate change and human rights, I think that's what's needed to get it to the next stage where we do actually get the court to deal with this matter. So I think, thank you for that. And I think that's what I'll say about that at this point.
The Honorable Ralph Regenvanu, we appreciate you for sharing your insightful knowledge on the inequity Vanuatu and other countries like it are experiencing, as well as the need for a liability system to ensure that the loss and damage experienced by frontline nations like yours are accounted for. There is an undeniable need for justice in practice rather than just in theory, and we surely need leaders like you during these unsettling times. Thank you too much, Honorable Ralph Regenvanu. Our next speaker is also a big name in the legal space who has made pioneering contributions to both Philippine and global jurisprudence through his work on the right to sue on behalf of future generations to stop environmental damage today. Attorney Anthony Aposa is also known for his work to protect the Philippines' forests and marine environment, and for his work with the Normandy Chair for Peace. He will be speaking to us today on the doctrine of intergenerational responsibility on the environment and why this must be the center of the legal question that will be posed to the ICJ. He will also share his personal and professional experiences over the years, which will be valuable for us young legal campaigners to hear. Sir, welcome to the panel. You have the floor for 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll just tell you a story. One day, young people, young men and women like you, went up the mountain, and then when it started to rain, they hid in a cave. And in the cave, there was a wall that had a word environment. So they looked at each other. Says, what is the word environment? Is it about the birds and the bees and the monkeys and the flowers and the trees? Or is it about life and the sources of life of land, air, and water? Where the trees and the forest are the heart and the lungs of the earth, where we get our air. Where the land and the soil is the skin and the flesh of the earth, from whence we get our food. And the sea and the rivers are the blood and blood streams of life. Land, air, and water. Easy to remember, LAW, that is the law of life. And as my good spirit brother David Boyd was just saying, what is the highest right? The highest right is the right to life. And together with the right to life is the right to the sources of life, of land, air, and water. What is life if there is no air? What is life if there is no water? Now, let's go to climate justice. We all know what climate means and what the dangers are. But what does justice mean? It sounds very heavy. But justice simply means giving or getting what we deserve. And the question, my dear friends, my dear young friends, is do you and your children deserve the earth that we, our generation, is leaving behind and that you will inherit? But there is a problem here that is called the paradox of progress. That the things that make our lives comfortable today will be the same things that will make our lives tomorrow miserable. We have running water, very good. Now we're wasting water. We have electricity, so we waste electricity. We run our motor vehicles to get from one place to another, so we burn fossil fuels. We handle all these material things, the packaging, and then throw it away. Then throw it away to the rivers, or throw it away to the sea. And then we took 100, 200 million years to become fossils that they are. We take them out in a matter of hours and burn them in a matter of seconds, and we call it progress. That, my friends, is the backstory of the I Am Climate Justice, ICJ movement. It says ICJ stands for I Am Climate Justice. Where does change begin? Does it begin with government? No. Governments change. Look at the Paris Agreement. All of a sudden, in one single stroke of his pen, somebody just, one of the major polluter of the world, just took out his signature. Where does change begin? Real change begins within. If you just simply use a glass of water when you're brushing your teeth, or you turn off lights and gadgets when they're not in use, you become the change that you want to see. That is the point, my friends, that in each of our hands live the power to give justice to the present and future generations. My dear friends, if you want change, you must be the change that you want to see. Then, and only then, will there be a real climate of change. That, my friends, is a butterfly effect. No matter how little you do, that little will make a lot of difference one day. There are also practical cooperative movements going on now. Our friends, we're all worried about food. So the solution is to put up food gardens, community food gardens. There was this movement just June 5 that was launched in the Philippines, where young people like Nicole are gathering people to plant vegetables in their respective communities. Road sharing is a movement to reduce the use of motor vehicles and give spaces for people to walk, to bike, and for non-motorized mobility. And I was listening to Honorable Regenvanu Ralph, and rainwater is going to be very, very serious. The solution is rainwater catchments, simple rainwater catchments. When there is rain, do not waste it. ICJ also, my friends, stands for the International Court of Justice, where a group of young people like you have been thinking about suing the whole world in the highest court of the world. But it is not an adversarial case. It's going to be an advisory opinion. Ask a question. My friends, that is the beauty of a legal action. It lights a star. What is a star? Number one, it tells a story. Remember the power of a story. You can tell the story of the reality, the immediacy, and the clear and present danger of what is happening in the climate crisis. You talk about it in media, you talk about it in Congress, who's going to listen to you? But if you tell the story in a court of law and put the issues on the table for proper, orderly discussion backed by evidence, then people will begin to listen. And somehow or other, it will spark action. And sooner or later, win or lose, there will be a resolution. That, my friends, is what the legal action can do. It lights a star. And my friends, this is not a dream. Young people, you young people, September 23 last year, I understand. So Alexandria was part of that. That's very good. Congratulations. The day after, a group of young people also went to file that petition in the UN through the Philippine embassy to seek that advisory opinion. In fact, 2 days later, I had the good fortune of meeting the Honorable Regenvanu Ralph in the meeting organized by the Columbia Law School. That is the piece of paper that they submitted. It already contains a draft of the assembly. I mean, a draft of the resolution. Where is it going? I do not know. But it is going to be thrown away, but it is for you, my friends, to follow it up. And the question is simple. It's as simple as possible. In this climate crisis, what are the duties of states to future generations? Using the idea of future generations takes it out from simply being a legal question to becoming a moral question. Do your children, your grandchildren deserve the earth that we're leaving behind? Why a simple question? There's a nice saying that says, If you want to be heard, tell a story. If you want to touch the heart, sing a song. If you want to start a revolution, even a peaceful revolution of the mind and of the heart, if you want to start a revolution, ask a question. You young people have linked up with one another. Very good, congratulations. But my friends, after all the wounds of war and bruises of battle that I have faced, I discovered a new pathway. That fighting is not the solution. We all know what we need to do. We just need to be inspired to do it. But most everything that happens in this world is not bad, but we only hear of the bad and the sad. Because bad news sells, it's making us all feel stressed, depressed, hopeless, and helpless. No, we are not. We can change the story of the world when we change the storyline from bad to good, from sad to happy, from negative to positive. That, my friends, is your bridge to a better and brighter world. This is the Good Stories movement. I will share, if you have time, there is a short 3-minute film take-home messages, my friends. One is the environment is not about the birds and the bees. It is about the land, air, and water of life. Number two, be the change that you want to see. Number three, change the story by simply changing the storyline. My dear friends, in conclusion, may I ask everyone to please read this aloud. 10, 50, 100 years from now, and many generations hereafter, let it be said that during our watch, while gifted with intelligence and insight, with privilege and position, with the wealth of wisdom, and with the freedom and power of my human will, let it be said that in our time and during our watch, we did our share. And maybe, just maybe, we will make a little difference. It is easy to make money, but it is more meaningful to make a little difference. Ladies and gentlemen, young people from around the world, including Honorable Regenvanu and my brother David Boyd, can you please read this last line aloud? Above the wild waves, the raging rain, and the clashing clouds of today's crisis of life is the golden sun of hope. Thank you, congratulations, and good luck to all of you.
Thank you so much, Sir Anthony Oposta, for your very insightful story and take-home points. The wisdom you've offered us as we chart the path forward will be invaluable, and I think I can speak on everyone's behalf when I say that. It's very motivating to know that this movement has your support as we chart the path forward. Our final panelists are bringing a joint presentation to you, explaining the advisory opinion from the ICJ in greater detail, and why it is needed in our fight against climate change. Joining us as representatives of the World Youth for Climate Justice, we have Vishal Prasad from the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, and Nicole Ponce from the I Am Climate Justice Movement. Vishal and Nicole, welcome to the panel. You both have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Kiona, for that welcome, and a very warm Pacific welcome to you all. It really is a pleasure to have you all join us for the launch of the WYCJ, and we appreciate your support for this movement. The title of this event talks about seeking justice at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, which is the world's highest court. Why do we need to take the issue of climate change to the ICJ? Mechanisms dealing with the climate crisis? But sadly, the opposite is true, as you've heard from our speakers before me. The climate crisis continues to prove catastrophic for the world now and even more for the future generations, as the recent spate of bushfires, rising of seas, cyclones, and droughts have proven. Clearly, there's something amiss, a disconnect that exists in our approach to address the crisis. Since 1992, climate change has been on the global agenda when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change came in place. And since then, several key agreements such as Kyoto, Rio, and recently Paris have come in. But despite these, the deadlock on climate action continues. During our campaign, we've had several questions asked of us on how the ICJ can help break this deadlock. The ICJ is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations and has the authority and jurisdiction to deal with the totality of the key legal questions that arise in relation to climate change, precisely on the clarification of the obligations of states, not only on prevention, but also on burden sharing. The lack of consensus between states on their obligations to the climate agreements has been a major stumbling block to progress. And in spite of positive outcomes in negotiations, there will still be legal ambiguities. It is therefore for the UN General Assembly to request the ICJ for their advice on the future generations of states and other actors by international agreements and general international law in relation to climate change. As highlighted in the Power of the People animation shown earlier, although the ICJ advisory opinion is not binding, it has great legal and moral authority that can provide the much needed clarification and reinforce guidance to states to fulfill their targets that they have set to reduce emissions. In other words, an advisory opinion from the ICJ would be like a beacon or a lighthouse, if you may, that would illuminate, clarify, and direct the path that must be taken without any ambiguities if we are to avert this crisis. For this reason, we see an advisory opinion as complementary, as a friend to ongoing climate negotiations, because it would help clarify and reinforce many of these agreements which are vital in attaining our climate goals. Along with these, an advisory opinion can also help drive climate action in 5 broad ways. First, it would also help encourage more ambitious action under the Paris Agreement in the areas of finance, adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. The voluntary nature of the Paris Agreement requires continued encouragement for more ambitious action among states, and the advisory opinion, while complementing the Paris Agreement, can also encourage greater action. In doing so, the advisory opinion would also help set more concrete and authoritative baselines for state action in reducing their emissions and meeting their human rights and climate action responsibilities fully. The advisory opinion would also help cement consensus on the scientific evidence on climate change. Despite obvious changes in the climate and overwhelming evidence confirming the occurrence of the phenomena, there remain climate deniers who are unnecessarily hindering the work of addressing the crisis. An advisory opinion would help cement this consensus on the reality of climate change. Also, an opinion from the ICJ, the world's highest court, would provide clear guidance for adjudications, future adjudications at the national, regional, and international levels, drawing on the strong legal and moral authority of the court. Advisory opinions, therefore, would greatly assist domestic and national courts in guiding the development of national laws. But apart from these 4 significant contributions, we believe an ICJ advisory opinion can bring to the climate fight one more contribution, and perhaps the most important one, which is integrating the nexus between human rights law and international environmental law. This is particularly important because of the impact of climate change on the human rights of people, and because it has a great range, and the ICJ is the only judicial body that deals with all the legal issues arising from this. And not only this, the advisory opinion is also important because it links 2 bodies of international law, that is human rights law and environmental law, which have been running in parallel to integrate and develop together. This integration would allow for greater bolstering of the authority of human rights bodies and would also greatly advance group rights, such as those of indigenous peoples, who have an additional layer of impacts brought about by climate change because of their very close relationship to the environment and their surroundings, which is now severely under threat.
And to reinforce what Vishal has said, there is a need to reconnect people with the planet. Our lives are already interwoven with all the life around us, no matter whether we live in the city or in the forest. But sometimes we forget this. The fact that we can grow enough food for every year to feed nearly 8 billion people is nothing short of a miracle. We could not have done it on our own. 1 out of 3 bites of food that you eat in your life exists only thanks to the thousands of species of bees, butterflies, moths, beetles, birds, and bats that pollinate them. It is simply a level of understanding that goes beyond what most of us are taught to know in the modern day. Once you see that connection that all of us on this planet Earth share, you have no choice but to act. And it's not just our connections to other species, but to each other as human beings too. We have become so focused on the individual when it is through our collective efforts that we have come this far. As nature would have it, when we band together, we not only survive, we thrive. This is our true power as people. Meanwhile, in the Brazilian state of Maranhão, a group of indigenous Guajajara paint their faces and wear bulletproof vests as they wake up to another day of defending what is left of the Amazon forest. Unfazed by the danger lurking in their own land, these guardians of the forest, all 120 of them, manage land against environmental crimes. These Amazon heroes refuse to give up. In the words of Lercio Silva, a guardian of the forest, to defend our land is to defend our people. This is the story of hope and resilience and triumph of the human spirit, and a beautiful narrative of the power of the people. Indigenous Guadalajara protects not only precious land, but a whole civilization built around it. The World's Youth for Climate Justice seeks to do the same by uniting young people and like-minded individuals to seek an ICJ advisory opinion. We aim to create a butterfly effect. As you have seen in our animation, with one final stroke of the gavel, the advisory opinion from the world's highest court can cause ripples of impact in climate actions across the globe. World leaders will be compelled to listen, and more importantly, will be compelled to take action. We shall use the role of the court as a guardian of the rule of law at the international level in order to influence and convince states to address the climate crisis. And by seeking such advice from them, the advisory opinion will not be imposed on states by an outside legislator. It will be designed and assented to by the states themselves, not out of force, but based on mutual interests and shared values. This is the kind of real and transformative change we need to attain climate justice. The good news is, this has been done before. Take the ICJ advisory opinion on nuclear weapons. It has become an extremely useful tool for both governance and the peace movement. Following the decision, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution which led to the conclusion of a nuclear weapons convention, an agreement to abolish nuclear weapons. And thereafter, the peace movement, empowered by these successes, mobilized international support behind the World Court project. This was acknowledged as the most radical disarmament issue within the United Nations for over 30 years. It embodied the hope of the UN Charter, where we, the peoples, would work with the United Nations representatives to maintain peace and to promote better standards of life. From this, it is apparent that an advisory opinion is a powerful tool of international relations. It carries with itself the ability to shape international policies and raise global consciousness on climate change and human rights. The ICJ advisory opinion on nuclear weapons is a perfect example of how a campaign like this can translate into genuine and meaningful actions. This pandemic has only heightened the issues surrounding climate change and human rights. It highlighted the urgency of these matters, which, in order to be addressed, require the collective cooperation of states, hence why we need to go to the UN General Assembly. As what the President of the ICJ, Honorable Yusuf, said in his address to the United Nations General Assembly this year, quote, "No state, however powerful it may be, can provide security, prosperity, and a clean environment to its people without cooperating with other states. Unless this system of rules is respected by each state, the edifice of multilateral cooperation may collapse." End quote. The ICJ advisory opinion provides a perfect opportunity to reinforce the structures and the foundations of multilateralism due to the very nature of its processes. At a time when global cooperation seems to be spiraling, an initiative that can unite the world into a common mission would undoubtedly breathe a new life into the global multilateral architecture. But apart from this, the fate of the world and the state of the climate are all urgent calls to action that this campaign aims to heed. It is the strongest force behind our movement's actions. In sum, while there is great reason for optimism for an ICJ advisory opinion, it is not a magic wand that will wish away the climate crisis. It is, however, a great moral and legal call to urgent action, a lighthouse that provides direction to the uncommitted and unconvinced next step. That is the final negotiations to conclude a clear, just, and fair climate agreement, one that will strengthen multilateralism and the rule of international law, both of which are pivotal to humanity's best chances of surviving this self-induced climate crisis. In a representative fashion to the title, Power of the People, all that is needed to refer the matter of climate change and human rights to the ICJ is a simple majority vote in the UN General Assembly by the countries of the world. As Philip Sands powerfully said, In our world, amidst the warming of the atmosphere and the melting of the ice and the rising of the seas, the international courts shall not be silent. We, the youth of the world, shall not remain silent. Thank you, Binaka, Danyawad, and Salamat.
Thank you so much, Vishal and Nicole, for that very informative rundown of the campaign and for giving us that background on the campaign. It's very vital. On that note, we would like to move on to the Q&A session. We would love to take as many questions as we can from you all, so you can ask them on Zoom and also on Facebook Live. Please type your questions into the Q&A tab on Zoom. If you would like to direct your question to a specific panelist, please include their name in the question. And perhaps to kick things off, I'd like to ask a personal question to Alexandria. Alexandria, how can, or what can we youth do to make the Paris vision a reality? I hope to look at how an ordinary citizen like myself can make the Paris Agreement a reality, seeing that the heads of states are seemingly not keeping their promises.
Yes, so actually there's, first of all, a lot that young people can do, but I first want to say that right now, one thing that a lot of young people have been having conversations about is how the Paris Agreement is the right steps forward, but it is not sufficient enough for us to stay below that 1.5 degrees threshold. And so actually young people are looking at how can we go further and beyond that. And so one way that I have especially been paying attention to in making the Paris Agreement a reality is holding our governments accountable at these international conferences. So for example, I was at COP in Madrid, and there was such a lack of action by our political leaders there. And there was actually some countries that were stalling and weren't allowing a lot of the negotiations to go forward. And so there was such this lack of political will there. And so one thing that there's a youth movement called Polluters Out that's happening that they are focusing on for the next COP to make sure that we don't have polluters and those who are stopping us in making progress, making sure that they're out of the conversation. And so at this upcoming COP, the way it intersects with the Paris Agreement is because this upcoming COP is the COP where all of the countries, what they signed on for the Paris Agreement, they have to basically send in their homework now. And so I think that this COP now is the COP that we have to really make sure those countries upheld what they did. And if they didn't, we have to make sure that we're the ones there holding them accountable as the young people. So I recommend joining those movements that are really centering around these Conference of Parties and making sure that those governments there actually keep our best interests at heart.
Great, thank you so much for that, Alexandria. That was really helpful for me, and I'm sure to many others in the audience who had similar questions on that. All right, so the next question we have, so the next question is to Dr. David Boyd. In your experience, do most countries participate in an ICJAO, and is the hearing of the opinion public?
Oh, those are great questions. And I have to admit, I have personally never participated in an International Court of Justice advisory opinion. I'm sure that the actual hearing in today's age would be public. I mean, in current COVID-19 times, it would be online. Just as the case that I was involved in Brazil was televised live earlier this week. But I have to confess, I'm not totally familiar with the details of that process. I did want to just add two things to what Alexandria had said, though. One is that, yeah, it's super terrific to get involved with these youth organizations and get political, and the Fridays for Future movement is terrific. My daughter was actually out there today in Canada with her sign. But there's also something that young people can do, which is like just start acting on climate change. And so we're seeing this all over the world, young people who are doing things like getting their universities to divest from fossil fuels. That's a very powerful thing that young people have been highly successful in getting literally many billions of dollars of investments in coal, oil, and natural gas divested from their universities' trust funds. And another thing that students around the world have been doing successfully is putting solar panels on roofs of their schools, of their universities. I live on a small island on the coast of Canada. We had a solar initiative where we put 105 solar panels on the roof of the school. We put 51 panels on the community hall, 33 on the recycling center, 30 on the library. And because the cost of solar has come down so dramatically, it's really quite an affordable thing to do. And it feels so good for people to be part of the solution. So I just wanted to add that to the list of things that Alexandria mentioned.
Yeah, thank you so much for adding that, Dr. David Boyd. That's very helpful. All right, well, the next question is to Matt. From Matt, sorry. How can we convince the big polluters like Australia and the US to support an ICJAO? And this is a question for any panelists. So any panelists who would like to address this, please go ahead.
Well, it's a question that I think people in Australia and the United States need to elect new governments, because both of those countries are run by leaders who have no idea about the science of climate change and who are putting in place policies that are counterproductive, destructive, and unscientific. And so unless those leaders change, it's going to be very difficult to convince countries like Australia and the United States to support this initiative. But if you elect progressive leaders, then we could see those countries come on board.
Yeah, wonderful point. Everyone remember to vote, please, this November
Please,
if you're in
yes.
the US. Would any other panelists like to add to that?
I guess, yeah, kind of off of the what Dr. David Boyd was saying, I think that voting is extremely important, because in order for the United States, for example, to sign on, it would really have to be a change of administration that we have. I have been very active in the political, really pushing Biden and these candidates to be sustainable. Even though I'm 15, I still think that if you aren't of voting age, there's still a lot you can do in the political system. And so I've really been pushing our candidates like Biden to make sure that they have these sustainable approaches, and making sure that we have 100% renewable energy by 2035. And when we have an administration that has those goals at heart of making sure that we transition, it's just very important. And I think that they would definitely sign on with young people pushing them.
And I would just add to that I think it's criminal that you can't vote until you're 18 years old. I mean, we have people like Alexandria who are so smart, so knowledgeable. Their whole life is in front of them. Why don't they have a say in electing the governments? And we're actually starting to see countries around the world, in recognition of those facts, lowering the voting age. So Argentina, Austria, many countries around the world have already lowered the voting age to 16. And I think that's a really, really positive trend.
Thank you so much for your input.
Hello.
Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Tony.
Tony here. I just wanted to comment on the question of how can Australia and US support it. Aside from what has been done already, the beauty of a resolution to seek an advisory opinion is that you just need a simple majority, like between the AOCs and the group of 77. I'm sure they can get at least 100 votes. So yes, that's it. And I like the example set by David about you can actually take action in your own community. We mentioned taking action in your own personal capacity of not wasting things.
Thank you, sir, Anthony Opusa. And we have one final question, and we're seeking one answer from the Honorable Ralph Regenvanu. Just because we're running a little short on time, we're close to the end. How can Indigenous participation in international court proceedings on climate change be facilitated?
Thank you for the question. I mean, it's the state of recognition of Indigenous peoples is advancing all the time at the international level, but really to get that recognition, there would need to be states that sponsor it. And there are states that would be ready to do that. Not many, but Vanuatu, for example, would be one. And that needs to happen. The states need to bring these people to the table. And we've done it in the past. We've brought Indigenous people as part of our delegations. That isn't getting to the level of absolute outright recognition, but we're getting there. Thank you.
Thank you. Well said, Honorable Regenvanu. Thank you so much. All right. Well, this then brings us to the end of our side event, Youth Leading the Way, Seeking Climate Justice at the ICJ. I would like to thank our esteemed panelists for their very valuable time and remarkable presentations. I also extend my gratitude to the World's Youth for Climate Justice members and our audience for tuning in and watching from all over the world. From all of the panelists' perspectives, it's clear that there's one common thread: the alarming scale of climate change and the effect it's having on communities, especially frontline communities. Witnessing the alarming rate at which we are losing our land to rising sea levels, forest fires, and ocean acidification, to name a few, I speak for many in calling for the geopolitical crisis to be prioritized. Every millimeter of sea level rise, every fraction of a degree of warming matters. To embrace this crisis, we need concrete and well-justified solutions. We can overcome this challenge of the century if we all work together and band behind solutions such as the advisory opinion from the ICJ on climate change and human rights. You can learn more about this initiative on our website at WY4CJ.org. And if you are interested, please do not hesitate to contact us via email. Thank you all so much for your attention. You're welcome to stay on if you'd like, but otherwise, I wish you all the best. Thank you so much.
Panapanahon ng pagkakataon, may babalik bang kahapon? Natatandaan mo pa ba nang tayong dalawa ay unang magkita, panahon ng kamusmusan, sa piling ng mga bulaklak?